Her family called her Cookie. She was 16 years old, with long, wavy brown hair, a smile that lit up her face, and a deep love for the Beatles and roller skating. Her name was Sylvia Marie Likens. In 1965, her life, which promised to be ordinary and full of typical teenage dilemmas, was hijacked by a cruelty so profound, meticulous, and collective that her case became one of the darkest and most disturbing ever recorded in the United States. This is not just the story of a murder. It is the story of how evil can settle into an ordinary house, be fed by an entire community, and destroy a life drop by drop while the world around it chooses not to see, not to hear, and not to believe. This is the story of Sylvia Likens. Sylvia was the middle child of Lester and Elizabeth Likens, and the only one who wasn't a twin. She had two older twin siblings, Diana and Daniel, and two younger ones, Jenny and Benny. Sylvia and Jenny were extremely close. Jenny, who had contracted polio as a child and had difficulty walking, was fiercely protected by her older sister. The family was not the most stable. The mother, Elizabeth, had a record, and the father, Lester, worked as a carnival entertainer, constantly traveling with the circus. In the summer of 1965, the Likens family's life crumbled completely. Elizabeth was arrested for shoplifting. Lester, about to embark on another work trip, faced a dilemma: what to do with his daughters. He didn't think the circus environment was suitable for the girls. Then, a seemingly perfect solution appeared. Sylvia had befriended two sisters at school, Paula and Stephanie Baniszewski. Her father, Lester, met the girl's mother, Gertrude Baniszewski. She was a 36-year-old woman who looked much older than her actual age, marked by a life of hardship, abusive relationships, and chronic poverty. Gertrude was a single mother, raising her 7 children alone in a small, decaying house at 3850 New York Street in Indianapolis. Lester made a proposal to Gertrude. He would leave Sylvia and Jenny in her care for the next 3 months, and in return, pay her $20 per week. For Gertrude, who struggled to survive on a mere $55 a month in government aid, the offer sounded like a salvation. She immediately accepted, promising Lester she would care for his daughters as if they were her own. Lester, perhaps relieved to have solved the problem, perhaps negligent, did not inspect the house. He did not see the precarious conditions, the overcrowding, the filth. He simply left his daughters there and departed. For the first few days, the promise was kept. The girls integrated into the chaotic Baniszewski household. Gertrude's house was a hangout spot for the neighborhood kids, a place where they could smoke, drink, and have fun, away from the judgmental eyes of adults. Sylvia, Jenny, Paula, Stephanie, and the younger children, Marie, Shirley, and Jimmy, shared a room with only a mattress on the floor, where they took turns sleeping. But the fragile peace did not last. Lester's payments began to arrive late. The first week without the $20 was the trigger. Gertrude's facade of kindness collapsed. She dragged Jenny, the younger, more fragile sister, to the top of the stairs and whipped her with a leather belt, screaming, "I've taken care of you two bitches for a whole week, and for nothing!" The terrified girls did not tell their father during his next visit. They were afraid that if he took them away, Gertrude would find and kill them, as she threatened. They were trapped. To try and earn some money for herself, Sylvia started collecting empty soda bottles to exchange for a few cents. When Gertrude found out, her fury was demonic. She attacked Sylvia with a wooden paddle, beating her repeatedly on the head and back. This beating was not an isolated incident. It became a daily ritual. Soon, Gertrude, who felt sick and tired, delegated the task to her 17-year-old daughter, Paula, who carried it out with cruel zeal. The abuse became more complex, more sadistic. Sylvia's beauty and the attention she received from boys at school aroused the envy of Paula and Stephanie. They began accusing Sylvia of spreading rumors about them, calling them prostitutes. These accusations, often invented, served as justification for increasingly brutal torture sessions. The house became a circus of horrors. Neighborhood children were invited to participate. Boys like Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs, boyfriends of the Baniszewski sisters, became regular tormentors. Sylvia was beaten, burned with cigarettes, forced to undress and insert Coca-Cola bottles into her vagina for the amusement of the spectators. Her best friend, Anna, was convinced by Paula that Sylvia was bad-mouthing her, and in turn also participated in the torture. The food situation was inhumane. Sylvia was so hungry she would rummage through the trash for scraps. When she was caught with a moldy hot dog, Gertrude, Paula, and Coy forced her to eat it, and then, when she vomited, she was forced to eat her own vomit. Sylvia's father, Lester, visited his daughters occasionally. He saw the girls pale and frightened, but he believed Gertrude's explanations about accidents or street fights. He never investigated. His negligence was one of the many locks that kept Sylvia in her hell. The pinnacle of dehumanization came when Gertrude, in an act of pure premeditated malice, took a sewing needle and began carving words into Sylvia's abdomen. She didn't finish and encouraged the neighbor, 15-year-old Richard Hobbs, to complete the task. On her bloody, inflamed skin, he carved the phrase, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it." In another session, Richard tried to carve the letter S for Sylvia on her chest with a heated metal hook, but the mark became unrecognizable, resembling a 3. Sylvia's older sister Diana visited the house occasionally. On one such visit, Sylvia, desperate, whispered that she was being beaten. Diana inexplicably did not believe her. Gertrude then forbade any further contact. The last bridge to the outside world had been burned. External concerns arose but were easily dismissed. The school noticed Sylvia's injuries, and a child welfare officer was called. Gertrude coldly received the social worker and told an elaborate story. Sylvia was a promiscuous, troubled girl who had run away from home for a week and was attacked by a gang of boys. The social worker, deceived by Gertrude's convincing narrative, left the house without saving the young girl who was literally marked with the proof of her own supposed promiscuity. By early October, Sylvia's health collapsed. The repeated kicks to her groin left her with urinary incontinence. To Gertrude, this was another act of rebellion. As punishment, Sylvia was banished to the basement. Cold, damp, and dark, that space became her final torture cell. She was tied by her wrists and ankles, left hanging, her feet barely touching the concrete floor. In her final days, Sylvia knew what her fate would be. In a rare moment of privacy with her sister Jenny, she whispered with a voice that was already an echo of what it once was. "Jenny, I know you don't want me to die, but I am going to die. I can feel it." Worried about the possibility of Sylvia dying and the consequences that would bring, Gertrude took her out of the basement and forced her to write a letter. Dictated by her torturer, the letter was a forged confession in which Sylvia took the blame for everything. She claimed to have willingly gone out with a gang, had sex for money, caused her own injuries, and urinated on the furniture on purpose to annoy Gertrude. It was Gertrude's final attempt to cover her tracks. On the night of October 25th, the torture reached its final climax. Gertrude, Coy, and John Baniszewski, one of the older sons, beat Sylvia until she lost consciousness. Gertrude then stomped on her head. Upon regaining her senses, Sylvia, in one last heroic effort, began banging on the basement walls and floor, screaming for help. A neighbor heard the noises and muffled screams, but after a while, they stopped. He imagined it was just children playing and decided not to call the police. It was the last chance to save her. On the morning of October 26, 1965, Gertrude and Stephanie took Sylvia, who was barely breathing, to give her a bath. It was there, in the bathtub, that the life of Sylvia Marie Likens was extinguished. Her heart stopped, a victim of extensive and continuous trauma. The official cause of death would later be declared homicide due to multiple trauma and subnutrition. Panic set in at the Baniszewski house, not out of remorse, but out of fear of being discovered. Gertrude placed the body back on the dirty mattress and instructed one of her daughters to call the police. When the officers arrived, she handed them the forged letter. But the truth could no longer be contained. Jenny, the sister who witnessed everything, was the key. When taken away from that house of horrors, she told the police in shocking detail about the months of torture Sylvia had endured. The trial that followed shocked the nation. The prosecutor on the case described it as the most perverse and unbelievable thing he had ever seen. Gertrude Baniszewski and her daughter Paula were found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Stephanie Baniszewski and the young torturers Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs were convicted of manslaughter. However, justice in this case seemed to have a temporary character. Paula served only 3 years before being released. Gertrude was paroled in 1985 after serving 20 years. She lived in freedom for just 5 years before dying of lung cancer. Many of the other convicts served derisory sentences, 2 years or less. Some, like Richard Hobbs, died young. Others, like Paula and Stephanie, moved on with their lives with reports that Paula even became a teacher. A terrifying thought. Jenny Likens married, had children, and lived the rest of her life with the scars of what she witnessed. When she learned of Gertrude's death in 1990, her comment was brief and bitter. "Good news, the damned old Gertrude is dead, ha ha ha, I'm happy about that." The house on New York Street was demolished. In its place today, there is a church parking lot. A discreet memorial was erected in honor of Sylvia, an attempt to ensure that her short life is not remembered only for the brutality of her death, but as an eternal warning. The story of Sylvia Likens is a disturbing study of banal evil. She was not killed by a lone serial killer, but by an ordinary woman, her children, and a mob of ordinary teenagers in an ordinary house, in an ordinary neighborhood. It is a grim reminder that the deepest horror does not necessarily lie in the supernatural or the reclusive psychopath, but in the potential for cruelty that resides in conformity, envy, negligence, and the complicit silence of an entire community. It is a case that forces us to ask, where would we have been? Would we have been the person who heard the screams and called the police? Or would we have been just another in the crowd who chose not to see? May Sylvia Marie Likens, the girl who loved the Beatles and protected her sister, finally rest in peace.